When you decide to take on a crazy task like trying to review an entire catalog of video games, it leads to playing a lot of games that otherwise you'd probably never be exposed to. For examples of this, I present episode 36, Sesame Street Counting Cafe, and episode 137, Barney's Hide and Seek Game. Regardless of what you might think of those games or edutainment titles in general, they absolutely are part of the Genesis library. And you can't very well say that your goal is to collect and review an entire set of games and just selectively ignore certain titles because they might not be something that you feel is for you, or that might not be interesting from an algorithm perspective. And I've got to be honest, regardless of the fact that those games are clearly aimed at very young children, I really enjoyed playing and reviewing both of those games, with both titles earning, and I do mean earning, 3-star reviews from me. I've got to specifically shout out Barney's Hide and Seek Game for being far above and beyond the title that I expected, and clearly showed some effort and quality in a game aimed at an age group that isn't exactly known for having the most discerning tastes. And I bring all this up because now, 100 episodes later, it's time to tackle another Sega edutainment title. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and just got randomly dropped here due to searching for some possible slim shred of evidence that at one point it was indeed the BerenSTEIN Bears, to make your brains not crawl. Sorry, you're not going to find that here, and my best advice to you is keep your tinfoil tight. They're listening. Sorry, where was I? Oh yeah, introductions. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where rather than try to prove the lizard people are out to take over the world by, let me check my notes, spelling the name of a series of kids' books incorrectly, I'm actually instead out to collect and review not just video games that may or may not be part of some sort of vast conspiracy to do something, but also the nearly 1,280 other titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis, either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. If you don't get the Berenstain versus BerenSTEIN Bears jokes, well, count yourself lucky, but just in case you really want to know, I'd recommend the video that James Rolfe did about it, as it's one of the better angry video game nerd efforts, and the whole Mandela thing is way outside the scope of this video. Instead, I'm going to try to actually concentrate on a game that 100% exists, and has always existed, in the Berenstain Bears Camping Adventure, which was released for the Genesis in November of 1994, just in time for Christmas. While I have some fond memories of reading various Berenstain Bears books as a young child, by the time late 1994 rolled around, I had moved on to much more mature efforts like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So I'm pretty sure that I didn't even know that this game existed until I started collecting for these consoles. Between that and the fact that edutainment games can go in a lot of different directions, as we've already seen if you compare something like Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego to Barney's Hide and Seek Game, I have no idea what to expect with today's review. So let's get into it, but first a look at the package. Okay, and this is my copy of the Berenstain Bears Camping Adventure for the Genesis. It's in pretty good condition, certainly not perfect, but at least the outer cover is intact, minus the hang tab, and then the inner cover looks to be devoid of any water damage, sun bleaching, or edge wear. I'm definitely good with keeping this particular copy around, but if for some reason I needed to replace it, like most other Sega Club titles, it's not in high demand and currently sells for between $10 and $20. Also, like most other Sega Club titles, Berenstain Bears Camping Adventure was a North American exclusive, aside from a later release in Brazil, so there's no alternate European or Japanese versions to compare the game to. Just for full disclosure, the game was also ported to the Game Gear, but that version used the same art as this version, just with that purple Game Gear branding instead. As far as the cover goes, this is pretty much exactly what I would expect the cover of a Berenstain Bears game to look like. It's got the traditional art style that comes from the Berenstain Bears books, and just to compare, here's a few that I remember from childhood the Berenstain Bears in the Messy Room, and the Berenstain Bears and Too Much Junk Food. This has the cover art fit right in with those other titles and give the game a look as if it's truly an interactive volume of the series. Based on that art, I'm curious to see just how much grabbing of fish and beehives we'll be doing. One other small note about that front cover is that if you look down at the lower right-hand corner, you'll notice the VRC rating of GA for general audiences, but not only does it have that, it also has the note that it's specifically for ages 5 through 9, as Sega didn't have a more precise young kids rating in their VRC system. I only find that interesting because that would indicate that unlike some other edutainment titles, this is not a game for babies, but instead elementary-aged children. Flipping over the back, and we've got a pretty good looking back layout here with some art from the front reused, but more importantly 4 screenshots from the game on the right hand side, all of good quality and making the game appear to be very colorful, something that's important for a kid's game. And also, based on the screenshots, this looks to be a real game, not just some slapped together title with minimal activity. The flavor text to the left is well written and hits the high points, giving a base description of the plot, with brother and sister bear apparently wandering too far from camp and getting lost, and then having to find their way back to camp via passing through different areas, such as diamond caves and honey orchards? I'm not exactly sure what a honey orchard is, but I guess we'll just roll with it. I especially like this third bullet, or fish, point here. Bop bees, birds, wolves, and other tricky critters with the high-flying bear bottom bounce. The alliteration is just going buck wild today. Sorry. Anyway, opening up the package, and we've got the manual and cartridge both in decent shape, and unfortunately, by this time, Sega had gone to those crappy Xeroxed manuals. Even though it doesn't look great, the manual is actually filled to the brim with information, and this might just be a simple game aimed at kids, but the manual is not. And I'm willing to bet that some of the kids that this game is aimed at would not be able to read all this. And it's more for their parents to peruse and possibly assist their kids with the gameplay if they happen to get stuck in a section. I'm not going to complain about a good manual, but something tells me this might be one of the least read manuals in the library just due to all of that. Okay, well, that's the package. Let's bop some bees, birds, and whatever else with that bare bottom bounce. Just some quick background on the Berenstain Bears if you're not familiar with the characters. The Berenstain Bears were created all the way back in 1962 by Stan and Jan Berenstain, which is where the name comes from. So, for all you conspiracy theorists out there, BerenSTEIN, not BerenSTEIN, has always been what these books have been called because it's literally the names of the authors. Anyway, Stan and Jan Berenstain, who had already authored some non-Berenstain Bears books, apparently saw what Dr. Seuss was doing in the children's book realm and decided to try their hand at things, and, well, the rest is history, with there now being apparently over 400 books in the Berenstain Bears series, and I personally probably had about 10 or so of them growing up in the 80s. The Berenstain Bears license has been used sparingly on video games, with the Berenstain Bears Camping Adventure being somewhat unique in that regard. It wasn't the first game released in the series, that instead would be just the simply named Berenstain Bears on the Atari 2600, but other than that, console and not home computer releases have been few and far between, with really their only other appearance being on the CDI, if that even counts as a console release, and then 2 Game Boy releases in the 2000s. I suppose there was also the Sega Pico release, the Berenstain Bears A School Day, but I got a hard time calling the Sega Pico a console, just due to how unique it is. Having said all that, how does the Berenstain Bears Camping Adventure compare to the rest of that lineup? Well, remember in the intro where I alluded to the game falling into that edutainment genre? Well, yeah, it turns out that's completely wrong, and it is actually what sets the Berenstain Bears Camping Adventure apart from most other titles that use that Berenstain Bears licensing. This is a great example of don't judge a book, or video game based on a book, by its cover. And I think it inadvertently proves that I'm not kidding when I say my methodology for doing these reviews is to try to go into them as blind as possible so that I have as few preconceived notions about the game as I can. If it's a game that I didn't already experience back in the day, that is. Anyway, the point is that I am a big old idiot, and I assumed that because the Berenstain Bears Camping Adventure is part of the Sega Club series, and because many of the other Berenstain Bears titles are edutainment titles, that this would be one as well, perhaps similar to Sesame Street Counting Cafe, but with learning about nature instead of numbers. Well, and I'm very happy to say this, I was wrong, and instead, the Berenstain Bears Camping Adventure, and I've got to find a shorter way to say that, is a full-on platformer with little to no education value. That's right, if BB Camp, as I'm going to call it for the rest of the review, was located in the snack aisle of the local 7-Eleven, it would be a Snickers bar rather than just some granola. The plot of BB Camp is relatively simple. The Berenstain Bears are going camping. After driving to the campsite and setting up, Brother and Sister Bear are ready to go exploring while Papa and Mama Bear hold down the fort. This means that there's a few different options for playing the game, in that you can either play in single player, as either Brother or Sister Bear, or you get the somewhat uncommon option of simultaneous multiplayer, if you happen to have two people around the Genesis. If you play in single player mode, there's no difference between Brother or Sister Bear, they both have the same abilities, and it just comes down to who you want to play as, and then the few cutscenes in the game will change slightly as a result. Playing in multiplayer mode is largely what you would expect with both bears on screen at the same time. However, players will have to work with one another as both bears have to remain on the same screen at all times, and there's also some minor changes to the levels where both players will have to work together to climb up on certain ledges. Regardless of how you choose to play, the gameplay is relatively simple, which makes sense given not only the age group that the game is aimed at, but also just the fact that it's a platformer, which at least in the 16-bit era tended to not be overly complicated. For BB Camp, you have 3 actions, and hey, wouldn't you know it, the basic Genesis controller just happens to have 3 buttons. Essentially, one button is used to pick up one of 3 items, one button is used to use said item, and then you have a jump button, which will end up being the button that you probably use the most, as like in Sonic and Mario, your primary attack is going to be the one referred to on the back of the package, the fearsome bear bottom bounce. And I've got to say, I'm really glad that there were no typos with that anywhere on the package, because when I hear that phrase audibly, you know what, you're smart, you'll figure it out yourself. With that said, at the opening of the game, you'll have your choice of 4 areas to explore in your quest to find your way back to camp. Each area has a unique wilderness-related theme, such as cave adventure or going fishing. And each level, you have to collect a specific item. For instance, in cave adventure, you have to collect diamonds, and in going fishing, it's, well, fish. Probably didn't need to explain that one. Anyway, the goal is to collect a certain amount of those special items in each area so that you can open up a bonus area with entrances that are not unlike the portals that open above the lamppost in Sonic. Why, do you ask? Well, it's because there's actually a 5th final area, the Haunted Forest, but you can't open it up until you've gone to a bonus area in each of the other 4 levels. All the levels play pretty much how you'd expect levels in a platformer to go. Each level is made up of a few sections, with the final section having a boss to defeat before you're transported back to the initial level selection screen. It really is a full-on platformer, just with the difficulty turned down a notch so that it can appeal to the younger crowd. And if the game is too hard or too easy, there are even 3 difficulty choices that can be chosen at the options screen to tailor the game to whoever is playing. Something that oftentimes you don't see in platformers, as usually if there's a difficult jump or boss, you have to either just get stuck at it or get good. Having said that, I'm willing to admit my first time through the game, I might have died. Of course, you don't really die. If you're not able to make it back to camp, Papa Bear will come in and rescue you in a nice, but completely unsatisfying ending. To this point, even though the bears have lots of health and plenty of opportunities to gain more health or extra lives, if you're not careful, especially against a boss, you might end up seeing this screen yourself. And if you do, there are no continues and no saved progress, so you'll have no choice but to start over from scratch. I actually like this, as I think the game would be far too easy otherwise, and a leisurely stroll through the game will only take about 90 minutes as is, which seems to me long enough to have some fun, but not too long to the point to where it would be frustrating to have to start completely over. There are a few tricky parts in the game, and I eventually figured them out on my own, but I do wonder if kids would be able to, especially if they didn't have the manual or couldn't read it. Or were like me and decided, I don't need to read the manual, it's just a Berenstain Bears game, how complicated could it be? For instance, there's some platforms that you have to throw a rock at to get them to move into a position to jump on, or on the honey hunting level, there's trees with large holes in them that you have to enter by tapping up on the D-pad, at which point you're teleported to a different hole opening, similar to like an elevator system. Again, I was able to figure these situations out after a few minutes of wandering around like a moron because I'd only skimmed the manual, but I do have to wonder if a 5-year-old would be able to figure these things out on their own, especially since they're things that don't happen on every level. From a graphical perspective, I liked BB Camp a lot. Is it the most awesome looking Genesis game ever? No, of course not, but it is very colorful, and the artist got the style of the books down, with the game really appearing to be an interactive version of one of the books. Along with just how the art looks, the sprites are also animated well, with not just brother and sister bear moving across the screen smoothly, but also all of the enemies appearing to be very cartoon-like. I suppose I shouldn't be too surprised, as the game is the work of real-time associates who previously had also worked on Barney's hide-and-seek game, and thankfully they got the job done here again. While I wouldn't compare the game directly at all, I got a lot of the feel of Garfield Caught in the Act from BB Camp, but in a good way as it pertains to the best part of that game, the animation. The sound in BB Camp definitely takes a backseat to the graphics. However, that's not to say that the sound is bad, it's not, but it doesn't tend to stand out either. Instead, the background music does its job and just stays in the background for the most part, while the player concentrates on playing the game. I actually had to go back and look at the footage afterwards to get a good feel for the sound, and honestly, I think it's underrated a bit. There's plenty of music in the game, with each area getting its own music, and then a separate boss level track. And it's all good. It's not anything I would listen to outside of the game, but for a 16-bit platformer, it fits perfectly, and it's a lot better than I would expect in a game aimed squarely at young kids. And not only is the music solid, the sound effects are great as well. They're clear, something that's not always the case with FM sound, and they sound like some work was actually put into creating them, as it's not just a bunch of generic effects that you've probably heard somewhere else before. The Berenstain Bears Camping Adventure is the definition of pleasant surprise, and one of the reasons I love doing this channel. I never expected going into this review that I was going to enjoy playing this title. I assumed, quite wrongly, that this was going to be a shovelware edutainment game aimed at kids, and that I'd be having to try to do the review through the lens of its intended audience. But honestly, it's a fun platformer, regardless of age. And while sure, it's a bit simple and non-threatening, not every game has to involve thinking like you're MacGyver to try to figure out how to get from point A to point B, or involve harrowing action while you're always worried if you're going to lose your last heart. As a result, I'm giving the Berenstain Bears Camping Adventure 3 stars. While it's definitely not for everyone, there are lots of worse platformers on the Genesis, and I'd recommend fans of the genre to give it a chance for a bit. You might just have some fun. Okay, and that's it for the Berenstain Bears Camping Adventure. I mentioned it before, but this game is the epitome of why I do this channel. Had I not been doing a deep dive on every game in this library of titles, I absolutely never would have given this game the time of day. And that would have been a shame, because even though it's definitely not the most challenging game in the world, it was still a fun and enjoyable experience, and I'm glad I played it. I'm just waiting for the next bad platformer I play because I can say that it wasn't as good a game as Berenstain Bears, and it actually would have some meaning. Next time on Zilog and Moto, I had an open spot in the schedule, so I thought that with the NBA playoffs starting up that maybe I should get a basketball game in the schedule. However, when I saw that I'd already done 5 sports games so far in 2024, I figured that maybe I should pump the brakes on that, at least for a little while. Instead, a game that I just got from the Midwest Gaming Classic a few weeks ago caught my eye, so I think I'm going to fire that up instead. So if you happen to see that picture that I posted to the socials afterwards, you can narrow it down to 7 games, and I'll give you a hint. It's about as far from time killers as you can get, thematically anyway. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 236. If you liked what you just saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you are so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.